Hi there, my name is Dan Princiata, and I'm going to be speaking with you about some new analyses I performed on the influence of concentrated neighborhood poverty on schools, districts, and student success nationwide. Now, there were two sets of analyses which I performed. The first set was focused on schools, and the second set was focused on school districts. So on this slide, we can see the research questions that drove the school level analysis. And these questions included how many schools are located in concentrated poverty neighborhoods. We wanted to know how many students these schools served, how student outcomes varied by concentrated poverty, and we wanted to see if we could find evidence of the double burden that Richard spoke of, this idea that being poor hurts and being poor in a concentrated poverty neighborhood has even more deleterious effects. So our methods were kind of complex, but we've summed them up in a nutshell here. Basically, we just mapped school locations and school district boundaries. We overlaid neighborhood boundaries and neighborhoods as defined by census tracts. Then we associated the characteristics of the neighborhoods with schools. For our district level analyses, we aggregated the characteristics of neighborhoods and then associated those with school districts. And in both cases, after we did this, we ran descriptive analyses. So the data for the new analyses came from the American Community Survey, from the census, which provided shape files for both neighborhood boundaries as well as elementary and unified school districts. We pulled data from the National Center for Education Statistics Common Core of data, as well as EdFacts, which is a database kept by the U.S. Department of Education that includes information reported by schools, districts, and states related to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. All right, so how many schools are actually physically located in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty, and how many students are served by these schools? We found that about 6,600 schools nationwide were physically located in a neighborhood where at least 40% of the population was poor, and that this represented about 6% of all schools. Now, these schools served about 2.6 million students, or about 5% of all students nationwide. And when we broke out the results by school level, we found pretty similar findings across elementary, middle, and high schools, where elementary schools were somewhat more likely to be physically located in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. And actually, schools that had a grade distribution that didn't fit into the typical elementary, middle, or high school grade distributions were actually more likely to be in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. And we're planning to look more into this, but it's likely, at least our hypothesis is that it's possible that charter schools being built out in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty, grade by grade, could be behind this finding. Now, an important note to keep in mind as you're interpreting the numbers on this slide is that this is really a set of floor estimates, right? This is only schools that are located in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. We know that there are plenty of schools out there that are serving children who are living in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty, but the schools might not themselves be located in those neighborhoods. So now we're going to get into the findings from our preliminary analyses around student outcomes and how they vary by neighborhood concentrated poverty. So in this chart, we have grade 5 math and reading proficiency rates at the school level. And we can see that with the gray bars, about 69% of students nationwide are scoring proficient in both math and reading. With the blue bars, we can see that in schools that are not located in concentrated poverty neighborhoods, about 70% are scoring proficient in math and reading. And then we see that in concentrated poverty neighborhoods, just about 5 in 10 students in schools that are in those neighborhoods are scoring proficient in math and reading. Now, on our next slide, we're going to look just at economically disadvantaged students. And on this slide, we can see that the numbers dip across the board, but particularly for the overall numbers and for the numbers for students who are not in concentrated poverty. But we still see here evidence of a double burden, right? So even just among economically disadvantaged students, we still see that those students who are attending schools that are located physically in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty are performing worse on average, where about 50% are scoring proficient in both math and reading in schools that are located in concentrated poverty neighborhoods versus about 60% in other schools. When we looked at 8th grade results, we found very similar findings. We can see, particularly for math, even greater disparities between students who are in concentrated poverty schools versus schools that are not physically located in concentrated poverty neighborhoods. And again, we see evidence of a double burden. For high school, we decided to move away from proficiency rates and look at graduation rates, high school graduation rates, which we really consider a fundamental measure of school success for high schools. And you can see that nationally, we're about 8 in 10 students graduating on time according to the average cohort graduation rates. But in schools that are located in concentrated poverty neighborhoods, just 65% of students are graduating on time. Okay, so when we look just at economically disadvantaged students' high school graduation rates, we see that nationally about 3 in 4 are graduating on time, compared with 65% in high schools that are located in concentrated poverty neighborhoods. So again, we're seeing evidence that's consistent with the idea of a double burden. Now, before I move on to our school district analyses, I wanted to just note a couple of caveats. First, some of the estimates that are provided here would be slightly different than what you might get from a Department of Education report using the same year of data from the EdFacts, and that's because our analyses are based on public use data as opposed to restricted use data, and oftentimes public use data is presented in terms of ranges instead of point estimates, and whenever that was the case, we took the midpoint of any ranges that were 10 points or less to generate our estimates. A couple other caveats to note are that we know that the definition of what proficient is in reading or mathematics varies from state to state. So one thing future analyses could do would be to break out analyses by state or to try to standardize proficiency rates across states. The other thing to keep in mind is that our economic disadvantage category oftentimes lumps together students who are reduced price lunch and free lunch students, as well as students who are potentially eligible based on the community eligibility option, which some schools are adopting. And so this is not necessarily a perfect measure of economic disadvantage, and it may be that economically disadvantaged students in concentrated poverty schools are more economically disadvantaged than those in non-concentrated poverty schools. Finally, keep in mind that this is a conservative estimate, as I mentioned earlier, of schools that are actually serving students in concentrated poverty, because we're only focusing on those schools physically located in a neighborhood of concentrated poverty. So now let's get on with our school district analyses. These analyses were driven by 3 research questions. We were interested in what levels of neighborhood poverty school districts faced across the nation. We wanted to know which school districts were serving children in concentrated poverty and where these districts were located. And we wanted to try to identify school districts that were serving either large numbers or large percentages of students who were living in concentrated poverty. Okay, so what we found when we looked at the percentage of elementary and unified school districts facing various levels of neighborhood poverty was that almost half of these districts had at least one neighborhood with 20% poverty or above. 1 in 5 districts had at least one neighborhood with 30% plus poverty, and just 1 out of 10 districts had at least one neighborhood with 40% plus poverty, which was our definition of concentrated poverty. Now, one neighborhood does not a school district make, and so we decided to take a look at a couple of school districts up close and personal to underscore this point. This is a map of Baltimore City Public School District, and we're presenting neighborhood poverty levels on this map. The red neighborhoods are where 40% or more of the population are living in poverty. The orange neighborhoods are where 30 to 39% are living in poverty. The neighborhoods that are yellow are where 20 to 29% are living in poverty. Light green is 10 to 19%, and dark green is between 0 and 9%. And so what we can see here is that there's an urban core in Baltimore City where there's concentrated poverty, as well as neighborhoods that are 30% to 39% poverty, surrounded by neighborhoods that are less disadvantaged, but still facing some levels of disadvantage. Now, to present evidence that there's variation in levels of concentrated poverty even across urban public school districts, we present this slide here, which has neighborhood poverty levels in Detroit Public School District. And the district here, just like on the last slide, is surrounded by the light blue lines. And we can see that a very large percentage of the neighborhoods are 40% poverty and above. And this just underscores the fact that some of the educational challenges that Detroit Public School District is facing might be even greater than what's faced in Baltimore City Public Schools, for example. And so different strategies may need to be brought to bear to address the problems that they're facing. Here we have Ferguson, Missouri, since Richard raised that earlier in our discussion. And this is not a school district. This is actually a map of the city boundaries. And an interesting finding was that there are 4 school districts that actually serve Ferguson. And so we wanted to look at the entire city here. And we can see that there's one neighborhood of concentrated poverty, 40% plus, that overlaps with Ferguson. But another thing to keep in mind here is that even this orange neighborhood, that's 30 to 39% poor, when we looked at median incomes, this had the 8th lowest median incomes in the entire state. And so it just underscores this idea that poverty is not just about income, it's also about family structure. And we know that larger families are more likely to be classified as poor given any particular level of income. Okay, so now we're going to zoom out to the national level. And this slide is the only slide in the deck that I'm going to focus on 30% plus poverty neighborhoods. So this is the percentage of children in school districts nationwide that are living in 30% plus poverty neighborhoods. And so we can see the red here means that 25% or more children that are living within a district's boundaries are living in neighborhoods with at least 30% poverty. The orange is 10 to 25%, yellow is 5 to 10%, light green is 0 to 5%, and dark green is 0%. And this map looks very similar to maps that present poverty across the United States. We see real concentrations in the southeast and the south, southwest, as well as in the inland Pacific areas. Now, when we switch to looking at 40% poverty neighborhoods, we get a different map, and we can really see the patchwork of concentrated poverty across our country. So the legend here is similar as on the previous slide, but again, we're focusing on the percentage of children living within a district's boundaries that are living in 40% poverty neighborhoods. And what we can see is a vast majority of school districts have 0 children who are living in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. And then across these other categories, the light green through the red, we see that districts are relatively evenly distributed. About 2 to 3% of districts fall in each of these categories. And we know that about 2.75 million children live in concentrated poverty nationwide. This is about 5% of all children. 80% of that number, or about 2.25 million children, are in these top 2 categories, the orange and the red, and they're roughly evenly split across those 2 categories. Here we're going to zoom in on different regions of the country so you can get a better sense of what this looks like. This is the Northeast. Here we have southeastern districts, and one interesting thing to note here is that you can see these carve-out districts, right, where there might be a small district that is serving substantial percentage of children in concentrated poverty, surrounded by another district that has lower levels of concentrated poverty. Here we have the Midwest. Now here I've zoomed in on Michigan because we highlighted Detroit before. I just wanted to highlight the fact that there are other school districts within the state of Michigan that are serving high percentages of children living in concentrated poverty. Here we see southwestern districts by the percentage of children in concentrated poverty neighborhoods, and we can see that there are a group of districts that are along the border with Mexico that face a substantial problem with concentrated poverty, as well as school districts that are serving American Indians on reservations. And here we have our western districts. Now, before I move on, I just wanted to note a couple of caveats of our district analysis. The first is that these are really conservative estimates in that they're looking at all children living within the boundaries of a school district. If we were going to look just at those students who were actually attending school within the school district, we would probably see even higher percentages of children living in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty and attending the school district, because we would expect that students who are relatively well off would be more likely to be attending private schools. Second, in some cases, neighborhood boundaries and district boundaries didn't line up, and in that case, we assumed even distributions of children across neighborhoods so that we could allocate them to different districts. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, this is just based on unified school districts and elementary-only school districts. There's a small percentage, I think it's 3 or 4% of districts that are secondary-only school districts. And these are excluded because they would overlap geographically with the elementary-only school districts, and if we only use the secondary school district boundaries, there would be gaps in the map. All right, so after our geographic analysis, we wanted to take a closer look at the school districts with the highest numbers or percentages of in-boundary children living in concentrated poverty. So we basically rank ordered school districts by the number of children living in concentrated poverty. And we came up with this list, ranging from 180,000 children in New York City down to 29,000 in Memphis City. And what you can see here is that these are large urban school districts. So even though the percentages of children living in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty range from 54% in Detroit all the way down to a low of 8% in Dade County in Florida, we see that the overall number of students in the district being large translates to a relatively large number of students living in concentrated poverty. Now, the top 10 school districts from the previous slide actually contain 23% of the nation's total children living in concentrated poverty. And just 69 school districts contain more than half the nation's children living in concentrated poverty. That being said, as we saw in our maps earlier, there are small pockets of concentrated poverty throughout the country, and in fact about 1,250 school districts that have at least some concentrated poverty. And some of these districts face really substantial poverty rates. Now, when we ranked school districts by the percentage of in-boundary children living in concentrated poverty, we found that there were 24 districts nationally where all of the children living within the district bounds were living in concentrated poverty. And these listed here are the 10 largest of those districts. We have 4 Bureau of Indian Affairs school districts, 4 school districts serving border towns with Mexico, 1 school district that primarily serves children of Hispanic farm workers and fruit packers, and oddly enough, a district that serves Orthodox Jews in New York, where the men are in shul and are not working for income. Then we wanted to take a look at the school districts that had more than half of their in-boundary children in concentrated poverty. that were relatively large, right? From our initial list, we remember Detroit with 54% of their children living in concentrated poverty and a very large total number of children. There were no cities exactly like Detroit in terms of their size, but there were a good number of cities that had similar levels of concentrated poverty. So on this list, like Detroit, we see 4 additional Rust Belt cities that were former centers of manufacturing. We see Syracuse and Dearborn, Flint, and Reading. We see 3 border cities in Texas, as well as 2 mainly Hispanic communities. Now, to summarize our key takeaways from our original analyses, first, we found national evidence that is consistent with the idea that a double burden exists with respect to concentrated poverty. Second, we saw that concentrated poverty's geography is really a patchwork quilt across our nation. Third, we saw that there are a small number of districts that face substantial levels of concentrated poverty, and a very small and identifiable subset of districts that are making up the bulk of the problem. So let's keep these things in mind as we turn things over to Maxine to talk about potential solutions.